Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with part 12, the Speculative Science and the Operative Art of the Symbolism of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Chapter 11, the Speculative Science and the Operative Art. And now, let us apply this doctrine of symbolism to an investigation of the nature of a speculative science, as derived from an operative art. For the fact is familiar to everyone that Freemasonry is of two kinds. We work, it is true, in speculative masonry only, but our ancestor brethren wrought in both operative and speculative, and it is now well understood that the two branches are widely apart in design and in character. The one a mere useful art, intended for the protection and convenience of man and the glorification of his physical wants. The other a profound science, entering into abstruse investigations of the soul and a future existence, and originating in the craving need of humanity to know something that is above and beyond the mere outward life that surrounds us with its gross atmosphere here below. By speculative masonry, we learn to subdue our passions, to act upon the square, to keep a tongue of good rapport, to maintain secrecy and practice charity, lecture of fellow craft. But this is a very meager definition, unworthy of the place it occupies in the lecture of the second degree. Indeed, the only bond or link that unites speculative and operative masonry is the symbolism that belongs together to the former, by which, throughout its whole existence, is derived from the latter. Our first inquiry, then, will be into the nature of the symbolism which operative gives to speculative masonry, and thoroughly to understand this, to know its origin and its necessity and its mode of application, we must begin with a reference to the condition of a long past period of time. Thousands of years ago, this science of symbolism was adopted by the sagacious priesthood of Egypt to convey the lessons of worldly wisdom and religious knowledge, which they thus communicated to their disciples. Their science, their history, and their philosophy were thus concealed beneath an impenetrable veil from all the profane, and only the few who had passed through the severe ordeal of initiation were put in the possession of the key which enables them to decipher and read with ease those mystic lessons which we still see engraved upon the obelisks, the tombs, and the sarcophagi which lie scattered at this day in endless profusion among the banks of the Nile. Animal worship among the Egyptians was the natural and unavoidable consequence of the misconception by the vulgar of these emblematical figures invented by the priests to record their own philosophical concept of absurd ideas, as the pictures and effigies suspected in early Christian churches, to commemorate a person or an event, became in time objects of worship to the vulgar. So, in Egypt, the esoteric or spiritual meaning of the emblems was lost in the gross materialism of the beholder. This esoteric and allegorical meaning was, however, preserved by the priest and communicated in the mysteries alone to the initiated, while the uninstructed retained only the grosser concept. From the Egyptians, the same method of symbolic instruction was diffused among all the pagan nations of antiquity, and was used in all the ancient mysteries as a medium of communicating to the initiated the esoteric and secret doctrines for whose preservation and promulgation these singular associations were formed. To perpetuate the esoteric significance of these symbols to the initiated, they were established in the mysteries, of which institution we have still a trace of Freemasonry. Moses, who, as Holy Writ informs us, was skilled in all the learning of Egypt, brought with him from that cradle of sciences a perfect knowledge of the science of symbolism as it was taught by the priest of Isis and Osiris, and applied it to the ceremonies with which he invested the pure religion of the people for whom he had been appointed to legislate. Philo Judaeus says that Moses had been initiated by the Egyptians into the philosophy of symbols and hieroglyphics, as well as into the ritual of the holy animals. Hengstenberg, in his learned work on Egypt and the Books of Moses, conclusively shows by numerous examples how direct were the Egyptian references of the Pentateuch, in which fact, indeed, he recognizes one of the most powerful arguments for its credibility and for its composition by Moses. Hengstenberg, page 239. Hence we learn from the great Jewish historian that, in the construction of the tabernacle, which gave the first model for the temple at Jerusalem, and afterwards for every Masonic lodge, the principle of symbolism was applied to every part of it. Thus it was divided into three parts to represent the great elementary divisions of the universe: the land, the sea, and the air. The first two, or exterior portions, which were accessible to the priest and the people, were symbolic of the land and the sea, which all men might inhabit, while the third, or interior division, the Holy of Holies, whose threshold no mortal dared to cross, and which was peculiarly consecrated to God, was emblematic of heaven, his dwelling place. The veils, too, according to Josephus, were intended for symbolic instruction in their color and their materials. Collectively, they represented the four elements of the universe, and in passing, it may be observed that this notion of symbolizing the universe characterized all the ancient systems, both the true and the false, and that the remains of the principle to be found everywhere, even at this day, pervading Masonry, which is but a development of these systems. In the four veils of the tabernacle, the white or fine linen signified the earth, from which the flax was produced. The scarlet signified fire, apparently represented by its flaming color. The purple typified the sea, in allusion to the shellfish Myrex, from which the tint was obtained, and the blue, the color of the firmament, was emblematic of air. It is not necessary to enter into a detail of the whole system of religious symbolism as developed in the Mosaic ritual. It was but an application of the same principles of instruction that pervaded all the surrounding Gentile nations to the inculcation of truth. The very idea of the ark itself was borrowed, as the discoverers of modern Egyptologists have shown us, from the banks of the Nile, and the breastplate of the high priest with its Urim and Thummim was indebted for its origin to a similar ornament worn by the Egyptian judge. The system was the same, in its application only did it differ. The ark, or sacred boat of the Egyptians, frequently occurs on the walls of the temples. It was carried in great pomp by the priest on the occasion of the procession of the shrines, by means of staves passed through metal rings in its side. It was thus conducted into the temple and deposited on a stand. The representations we have of it bear a striking resemblance to the Jewish ark, of which it is now admitted to have been the prototype. The Egyptian reference to Urim and Thummim is especially distinctive and incontrovertible. Hengstenberg. With the tabernacle of Moses, the temple of King Solomon is closely connected. The one was the archetype of the other. Now, it is at the building of that temple that we must place the origin of Freemasonry in its present organization. Not that the system did not exist before, but that the union of its operative and speculative character and the mutual dependence of one upon the other were there first established. At the construction of this stupendous edifice, stupendous not in its magnitude, according to the esteem of Bishop Cumberland, it was only 109 feet in length, 36 in breadth, and 54 in height. But it was stupendous in the wealth and magnificence of its ornaments. The wise king of Israel, with all that sagacity for which he was so eminently distinguished, and aided and counseled by the Gentile experience of the king of Tyre, and that immortal architect who superintended his workmen, saw at once the excellence and beauty of this method of inculcating mortal and religious truth, and gave, therefore, the impulse to that symbolic reference of material things to a spiritual sense, which has ever since distinguished the institution of which he was the founder. If I deemed it necessary to substitute the truth of the assertion that the mind of King Solomon was eminently symbolic in its propensities, I might easily refer to his writings, filled as they are to profusion with tropes and figures, passing over the Book of Canticles, the great logical drama, whose abstruse symbolism has not yet been fully evolved or explained, notwithstanding the vast number of commentators who have labored at the task. I might refer to that beautiful passage in the 12th chapter of Ecclesiastes, so familiar to every Mason as being appropriated in the ritual to the ceremonies of the third degree, and in which a dilapidated building is metaphorically made to represent the decaying and infirmities of old age in the human body. This brief but eloquent description is itself an embodiment of much of our Masonic symbolism, both to the mode and the subject matter. In attempting any investigation into the symbolism of Freemasonry, the first thing that should engage our attention is the general purport of the institution and the mode in which its symbolism is developed. Let us first examine it as a whole before we investigate its parts, just as we would first views as critics the general effect of a building before we began to inquire into its architectural details. Looking then in this way at the institution, coming down to us as it has from a remote age, having passed unaltered and unscathed through 1,000 revolutions of nations, and engaging as disciples in its school of mental labor, the intellectual of all times. The first thing that must naturally arrest the attention is the singular combination that it presents of an operative with a speculative organization, an art with a science, the technical terms and language of a mechanical profession with the abstruse teachings of a profound philosophy. Here it is before us, a venerable school, discoursing of the deepest subjects of wisdom, in which sages might alone find themselves appropriately employed, and yet having its birth and deriving its first life from a society of artisans, whose only object was, apparently, the construction of material edifices of stone and mortar. The nature, then, of this operative and speculative combination is the first problem to be solved, and the symbolism which depends upon it is the first feature of the institution, which is to be developed. Freemasonry, in its character as an operative art, is familiar to everyone. As such, it is engaged in the application of the rules and principles of architecture to the construction of edifices for private and public use, houses for the dwelling place of man, and temples for the worship of deity. It abounds, like every other art, in the use of technical terms and employs, in practice, an abundance of implements and materials which are peculiar to itself. Now, if the ends of operative masonry had here ceased, if this technical dialect and these technical implements had never been used for any other purpose, nor appropriated to any other object than that of enabling its disciples to pursue their artistic labors with greater convenience to themselves, Freemasonry would never have existed. The same principles might, and in all probability would, have been developed in some other way, but the organization, the name, the mode of instruction would all have most materially differed. But the operative Masons who found the order were not content with the mere material and manual part of their profession. They adjoined to it, under the wise instructions of their leaders, a correlative branch of study. And hence, to the Freemason, this operative art has been symbolized in that intellectual deduction from it, which has been correctly called Speculative Masonry. At one time, each was an integral part of one undivided system. Not that that period ever existed when every operative Mason was acquainted with or initiated into the speculative science. Even now, there are thousands of skillful artisans who know as little of that as they do of the Hebrew language which was spoke by its founder, but Operative Masonry was, in the inception of our history, and is, in some measure, even now, the skeleton upon which was strung the living muscles and tendons and nerves of the speculative system. It was the block of marble, rude and unpolished it may have been, from which was sculpted the life-breathing statue. Thus did our wise Grand Master contrive a plan, by mechanical and practical allusions, to instruct the craftsman in principles of the most sublime speculative philosophy, tending to the glory of God, and to secure to them temporal blessings here and eternal life hereafter, as well as to unite the speculative and operative masons, thereby forming a twofold advantage from the principles of geometry and architecture on the one part and the perceptions of wisdom and ethics on the other. Calcutt, Candid Disquisition, page 31, edition 1769. Speculative Masonry, which is but another name for Freemasonry in its modern acceptation, may be briefly defined as the scientific application and the religious consecration of the rules and principles, the language, the implements, and materials of operative masonry to the veneration of God, the purification of the heart, and the inculcation of the dogmas of a religious philosophy. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.